The Bourbon had gone flat in Lieutenant Commander Reese Phoenix, Novik's glass 3 hours ago, but she hadn't touched it since the laughter started. 27 officers packed into the Miramar Officers Club, all eyes fixed on the delicate black ink spiraling up her left forearm, a phoenix rising from flames, wings spread wide beneath the words "born from ashes." What they couldn't see were the coordinates hidden within those flames: 33, 6,405 degrees N, 130, 8,777 degrees E Sasebo Naval Base, Japan. The night everything changed. "Look at that," Captain Bradley Morrison whispered to his drinking buddy, loud enough for half the room to hear. "Little Phoenix thinks she's some kind of warrior princess with her cute tattoo." The snickers rippled outward like shockwaves. Morrison had been riding her since she transferred in from 7th Fleet 2 months ago, his resentment as obvious as the whiskey on his breath. A female pilot with more combat hours than his entire squadron wasn't something his ego could process. But Reese had learned long ago that silence could be its own form of armor. She sat perfectly still, fingers tracing the condensation on her untouched glass, watching the reflection of overhead lights dance across the amber liquid. The tattoo had been fresh when she'd first walked into a ready room 8 years ago, the ink still tender against skin that had never known war. Now it was faded at the edges, weathered by salt air and countless missions that had carved her into something harder than the naive ensign who'd first dreamed of flying fighters. The worst part wasn't the mockery. It was how easily they dismissed what they couldn't understand. None of them had been there that October night when her FA-18 Super Hornet screamed through monsoon clouds over the South China Sea, her radar warning receiver lighting up like a Christmas tree. None of them had heard the desperate radio calls from a downed Coast Guard helicopter crew surrounded by hostile waters, or felt the weight of impossible odds crushing down on their chest at 25,000 feet. What they saw was a woman with delicate features and an artist's hands, someone who looked more suited for a museum than a cockpit. What they missed were the calluses from countless hours gripping a control stick, the slight scar above her right eyebrow from shrapnel that had peppered her canopy, and the way her dark eyes went perfectly still whenever someone questioned her place in the sky. That stillness wasn't fear. It was the quiet focus of someone who had stared death in the face and refused to blink first. Tonight, surrounded by their comfortable assumptions and casual cruelty, Reese felt that familiar weight settling over her shoulders. But this time, she sensed something different in the air. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the flight line, she could see storm clouds gathering on the horizon, their dark edges promising the kind of weather that separated true aviators from weekend warriors. And somewhere in those clouds, she knew, destiny was already writing its next chapter. The radio crackled to life in the corner of the room, cutting through the laughter like a blade. "All available aircraft. We have a code red emergency developing 40 miles southwest of Point Loma. Multiple souls in distress. This is not a drill." The laughter died instantly, replaced by the sound of chairs scraping against hardwood as officers scrambled toward their vehicles. But Reese remained seated, her eyes fixed on that horizon where lightning was beginning to dance between the clouds. Captain Morrison paused at the door, his face flushed with alcohol and adrenaline. "Don't even think about it, Phoenix. This is real pilot work, not some training exercise." His words hung in the suddenly empty room like a challenge waiting to be answered. Reese finally lifted her glass, downing the flat bourbon in one smooth motion before rising to her feet. The phoenix on her arm seemed to shimmer in the dim light, its wings catching shadows that looked almost like movement. Outside, the first drops of rain began to fall. The storm had been building for 3 days, a massive low-pressure system that meteorologists were calling a once-in-a-decade event. Winds gusting to 60 knots, visibility near zero, and seas running 20 feet or higher, the kind of conditions that turned routine missions into acts of faith. The Coast Guard had already grounded their helicopters, and every sensible pilot within 100 miles was securing their aircraft and praying their hangars would hold. But 40 miles southwest of Point Loma, The crew of a disabled fishing vessel wasn't concerned with meteorological wisdom. The Maria Esperanza had lost both engines and her radio during the height of the storm, leaving 8 souls adrift in mountainous seas with no way to call for help. It was only through the desperate ingenuity of a teenage crew member with a waterproof cell phone that their mayday had reached the Coast Guard at all. 3 bars of signal in the middle of hell, just long enough to transmit GPS coordinates before the phone died. Now, as rain lashed the windows of the Naval Air Station Operations Center, Rear Admiral Catherine Voss stood before a room full of her finest pilots, each one avoiding her eyes like guilty children. The mission was simple in theory: locate the vessel, assess the situation, and coordinate rescue efforts. In practice, it was a potential suicide run through the worst weather anyone had seen in years. "The Coast Guard can't get their birds up in this mess," Admiral Voss explained, her voice cutting through the sound of rain hammering the roof. "We need someone with the skill to navigate these conditions and the judgment to know when to pull back. I won't order anyone to fly in this. I need a volunteer." The silence stretched like a held breath. These were the Navy's elite, pilots who had faced combat over hostile territory and landed on carrier decks in rolling seas. But weather like this didn't care about medals or flight hours. It was an indifferent killer that had claimed more aviators than enemy fire ever would. Morrison shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his earlier bravado nowhere to be found. Around the room, other pilots studied their hands or stared at weather reports that read like horror stories. "I'll take it." The voice was quiet but clear, cutting through the storm noise like a blade. Every head turned toward the back of the room where Reese stood, her flight suit already zipped and her helmet tucked under one arm. The Phoenix tattoo was barely visible beneath her sleeve, but somehow everyone in the room was suddenly aware of it, as if the ink itself was speaking. Admiral Voss nodded slowly, recognizing something in the younger woman's eyes that reminded her of her own early days as a test pilot. "Phoenix, you understand what you're volunteering for. Weather reports show conditions deteriorating by the hour. You'll be flying into the teeth of this storm with zero margin for error." Reese met the Admiral's gaze without flinching. "Yes, ma'am. Those people have been out there for 6 hours already. Every minute we wait makes their situation worse." She paused, glancing around the room at faces that had mocked her just hours before. "Besides, someone once told me that real pilot work isn't done in training exercises." The barb hit its target. Morrison's face flushed red, but he said nothing. How could he? To object now would be to admit his own cowardice, and his pride wouldn't allow that level of honesty. Instead, he watched as Phoenix walked toward the door, her step confident despite the magnitude of what she was undertaking. "Phoenix," Admiral Voss called after her, "bring them home." Reese paused at the threshold, rain visible beyond the glass doors. "Always do, Admiral, always do." The hangar lights flickered as another gust of wind shook the building. In the distance, lightning illuminated the skeletal frames of aircraft secured against the storm. But one bird would soon be free, carrying its pilot into the dark heart of nature's fury on wings forged from determination and tempered by experience. The pre-flight inspection felt different in the storm's embrace. Each external check required Reese to brace herself against wind that threatened to knock her off the ladder, rain driving horizontally across the tarmac like liquid bullets. Her FA-18F Super Hornet, tail number 305, Resurrection, sat in the hangar like a caged predator, its twin engines cold but ready to breathe fire. The aircraft bore scars from her previous deployments. A patch on the vertical stabilizer where shrapnel had punched through during a close air support mission in Syria, stress fractures in the wing root from countless carrier landings, and her personal addition, a small Phoenix decal just below the canopy rail. Senior Chief Martinez, her crew chief, watched nervously as she completed her walk around. 22 years of naval aviation had taught him to read weather like scripture, and tonight's forecast was written in a language that spoke of broken aircraft and missing pilots. "Ma'am, I've got to ask, you sure about this? That storm's been eating aircraft all week. Coast Guard lost a helo 2 days ago, and that was in better conditions than this." Reese ran her hand along the leading edge of the wing, feeling for any imperfections that might compromise aerodynamics in the violent air ahead. "The difference, Chief, is that Coast Guard pilot was trying to get home. I'm trying to get someone else home." She looked up at him through rain-streaked safety glasses, her voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "That changes everything." The chief nodded, understanding something that Morrison and his circle never would. Real courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was the willingness to act despite fear when others needed you most. He'd seen Phoenix return from missions that had broken other pilots, her aircraft shot full of holes but her passengers alive in the back seat. Whatever drove her wasn't recklessness. It was something deeper, more fundamental. "Your bird's ready, ma'am. I've loaded extra fuel and configured her for low-level search patterns. Your FLIR pod is calibrated, and I've uploaded the last known position of that fishing boat into your navigation system." Martinez paused, then added quietly, "I also took the liberty of blessing the aircraft, ma'am. Old Cuban tradition my grandmother taught me. Figured it couldn't hurt." Reese smiled, the first genuine expression of warmth she'd shown all evening. "Thank you, Chief, for everything." She began climbing the ladder to the cockpit, each rung bringing her closer to a rendezvous with forces that had humbled aviators since the dawn of flight. As she settled into the ejection seat, the familiar ritual of strapping in took on an almost ceremonial quality. Shoulder harnesses, lap belt, leg restraints, each connection a promise between pilot and machine. The startup sequence proceeded with mechanical precision. External power connected, engines spooling up with their characteristic whine, hydraulic systems coming online with subtle vibrations that traveled through the airframe and into her bones. Phoenix had performed this dance thousands of times, but tonight each switch throw and gauge check carried extra significance. In conditions like these, there would be no second chances. "Tower, Phoenix 01 ready for taxi." Phoenix 01 Tower. Winds 240 at 55 gusting 70. Visibility less than 1 mile in heavy rain. Advise when ready for departure briefing. The controller's voice carried an undertone of disbelief. No rational pilot requested departure clearance in conditions like these. But Phoenix had stopped being entirely rational the moment she'd learned 8 people were dying slowly in the darkness, their hope fading with each passing hour. "Ready for brief, Tower." As she taxied toward the active runway, lightning illuminated the storm's architecture, towering cumulonimbus clouds that stretched beyond her aircraft's service ceiling, their internal structure alive with electrical fury. Soon, she would pierce that wall of violence, trusting her instruments and her hard-won skills against nature's most primal expression of power. The runway centerline lights disappeared into rain and darkness ahead, a path that led directly into the unknown. "Phoenix 01, you are cleared for takeoff. Winds now 250 at 60, gusting 75. Good luck out there." Reese advanced the throttle slowly, feeling 22,000 pounds of thrust push her into the storm's waiting embrace. The takeoff roll was a battle from the first 100 feet, crosswinds trying to push her off centerline, rain obscuring her view, wind shear attempting to rob her wings of lift just as she rotated skyward. But Resurrection clawed its way into the air with the determined grace of its namesake, climbing through turbulence that would have grounded commercial aviation. At 500 feet, she entered the cloud deck and the world disappeared. No horizon, no reference points, just the green glow of instruments and the constant violence of air trying to tear her aircraft apart. The altimeter needle swung wildly as massive downdrafts and updrafts tossed her Hornet like a toy. At 3,000 feet, a particularly vicious gust rolled the aircraft nearly inverted before she could counter with stick and rudder. "Phoenix 01, contact departure on 254.7. Weather update shows conditions worsening at your destination." Switching to departure, Reese's voice remained steady despite the punishment she and her aircraft were enduring. This was what separated naval aviators from other pilots, the ability to maintain focus and professionalism when the world was trying to kill you. She'd learned that lesson over hostile territory, where losing concentration meant dying in foreign soil. Tonight's enemy was different but no less deadly. The radar showed the storm's true scope, a massive spiral of destruction stretching from horizon to horizon, its eye still hours away from their position. Lightning flickered continuously within the cloud structure, creating a strobe effect that turned her cockpit into a disco of death. Each flash illuminated rain streaming past her canopy like silver bullets, occasionally revealing brief glimpses of the ocean far below, a roiling mass of whitecaps and foam that looked more like molten metal than water. 20 miles from shore, her radar picked up the first contact, a small blip that appeared and disappeared with each sweep, barely distinguishable from sea return and weather clutter. The Maria Esperanza, if that's what it was, lay directly in the path of the storm's most violent quadrant. Reese began her descent, dropping through layers of turbulence that rattled her teeth and tested every rivet in her airframe. At 2,000 feet, she broke through the cloud base and saw the ocean's true fury. Waves towered 30 feet above the mean sea level, their crests torn away by winds that had lost all resemblance to normal weather. In the distance, barely visible through sheets of rain, a dark speck rode the mountainous swells like a cork in a washing machine. The fishing vessel was still afloat, but barely. Her FLIR system revealed figures clinging to whatever handholds they could find as walls of water crashed over their bow. They'd managed to rig some kind of sea anchor to keep from broaching, but it was only a matter of time before the storm claimed them. Reese keyed her radio to the emergency frequency. "Vessel in distress, this is Navy Phoenix 01 overhead your position. Do you copy?" Static filled her headphones, broken by fragments that might have been human voices. The storm was jamming radio communications as effectively as any enemy electronic warfare system. She circled the vessel at low altitude, her engine screaming over the wind noise as she assessed the situation. 8 people were visible on deck, all wearing life preservers but clearly exhausted from their ordeal. The boat's superstructure showed damage from repeated wave impacts, and her hull rode low in the water, taking on water faster than her pumps could handle. This was the moment of truth. Coast Guard helicopters were grounded, surface vessels couldn't reach them in time, and her fuel was burning at an alarming rate fighting the headwinds. Phoenix had found them, but now came the harder question. What could one fighter pilot do against the fury of the sea? The answer came to her as lightning illuminated the phoenix on her arm, a reminder of what rising from ashes really meant. Sometimes salvation came not from having the right tools, but from refusing to accept that the tools you had weren't enough. She reached for her radio and began transmitting on every emergency frequency simultaneously. The first Coast Guard C-130 Hercules responded to her call within minutes, its crew initially skeptical of the fighter pilot's assessment until they heard the controlled desperation in Phoenix's voice. Lieutenant Colonel James Anchor Rodriguez had been flying search and rescue missions for 12 years, and he recognized the sound of someone who had found what others had given up for lost. Phoenix 01, Rescue 64. We're launching from North Island with full SAR package, but we're looking at 45 minutes to your position in these conditions. Can you maintain contact with the vessel? Reese checked her fuel gauges and ran quick mental calculations. At this power setting, fighting constant headwinds and turbulence, she had perhaps 30 minutes of fuel remaining, not enough to wait for the Hercules and still make it home. But leaving meant 8 people would spend another 3/4 of an hour alone in the storm, and she'd seen how quickly situations like this deteriorated. Rescue 64, I can give you 30 mics max. After that, I'll need to RTB for fuel. She paused, watching another massive wave crash over the fishing vessel's bow. Be advised, the survivors look exhausted. I don't think they'll last much longer. Understood, Phoenix. We're pushing as hard as we can. Below, the Maria Esperanza was fighting a losing battle. Each wave drove more water into her hull, and the crew was visibly weakening from their prolonged exposure to the elements. Reese could see them taking turns at the pump, but their movements were becoming sluggish, the first signs of hypothermia setting in. In water this cold, they had hours at most before their core temperatures dropped to dangerous levels. She made a decision that would have horrified her flight instructors but felt absolutely right in the moment. Dropping to 300 feet above the surface, she began flying a tight circle around the fishing vessel, her position lights strobing through the darkness like a lighthouse. The message was clear: you are not alone. Someone knows where you are, and help is coming. The psychological effect was immediate. Through her FLIR system, she could see the survivors pointing at her aircraft, their body language changing from despair to determination. One of them, she thought it might be the captain, waved both arms over his head in acknowledgement. The simple act of being seen, of knowing that rescue was possible, had given them reason to keep fighting. But maintaining such a low altitude in these conditions required every ounce of skill Reese had accumulated over 8 years of naval aviation. Downdrafts off the wave crests threatened to drive her into the water, while sudden updrafts tried to stall her aircraft or slam her into the cloud deck above. Her hands moved constantly on the controls, making dozens of minute adjustments every minute to keep Resurrection stable and airworthy. At 15 minutes remaining fuel, her radio crackled with an unexpected transmission. Phoenix 01, this is Jolly Green 67 inbound from the north. We're a Pave Hawk out of 29 Palms, diverted to assist. Reese felt a surge of relief that she quickly suppressed. Air Force pararescue, the only people in the military trained and equipped to attempt a rescue in conditions like these. Jolly Green 67 Phoenix. Be advised winds at surface are gusting over 70 knots with 30-foot seas. This is not going to be a standard hoist operation. Copy that, Phoenix. We've got Senior Airman Taylor in the back. He's got more water time than a Navy SEAL. If anyone can make this work, it's him. The HH-60G Pave Hawk appeared through the rain like a ghost, its rotor disc barely visible as it fought the same winds that were testing Phoenix's fixed-wing aircraft. The helicopter's pilot, she could see 2 figures in the cockpit through her night vision, was performing miracles just to maintain position over the fishing vessel. Helicopter rescue in these conditions was exponentially more dangerous than her own mission. At least she could fly away from the worst turbulence, but they had to hover in it. Phoenix Jolly Green, we're going to need you to provide wind reports and surface conditions while we attempt the pickup. Your fuel state. 10 minutes to bingo fuel, Reese replied, her professional calm masking the growing urgency of her situation. Bingo fuel meant she had just enough gas to make it home if she left immediately and encountered no delays. Understood. Stand by for hoist operations. What happened next would be talked about in ready rooms and crew lounges for years to come. Senior Airman Marcus Taylor, a pararescue jumper with more ocean rescues than anyone in the Air Force, descended through 70-knot winds on a cable that swayed like a pendulum in the turbulence. 3 times the helicopter pilot had to abort the approach as sudden wind shifts threatened to slam the aircraft into the fishing vessel's superstructure. 3 times Taylor swung back up to try again. On the 4th attempt, he reached the deck just as a massive wave broke over the bow. For a terrifying moment, Phoenix lost sight of him in the foam and spray. Then she saw him emerge, clinging to the boat's rail with one arm while signaling the helicopter crew with the other. He'd made it down, but getting back up with survivors would be infinitely more difficult. Phoenix Jolly Green, we're taking the most critical casualties first. Looks like we've got 2 who are barely conscious. This is going to take multiple trips. Reese's fuel situation had moved from urgent to critical, but she couldn't leave now. The psychological anchor she provided for the survivors was the only thing keeping them fighting against hypothermia and despair. Jolly Green, I'm staying until the last pickup. Do what you need to do. Phoenix, that puts you below bingo fuel. You might not make it back. The words hung in the static-filled air between them, a simple statement of mathematical fact. Fuel flow versus distance remaining versus weather conditions, the equation that had killed more aviators than enemy action ever would. But sometimes the numbers didn't matter. Sometimes there were things more important than personal survival. Jolly Green, those people have been out here for 8 hours. They don't get to go home unless we all do our jobs. Let's get it done. The next 20 minutes unfolded like a carefully choreographed dance between 3 aircraft and 8 souls who refused to surrender to the sea. Taylor worked with methodical precision, securing each survivor in the rescue basket and signaling for extraction while 100-mile-per-hour winds tried to turn him into a projectile. The Pave Hawks crew chief performed miracles of airmanship, coordinating hoist operations while his pilot fought to maintain position over a target that moved like a cork in a blender. And Phoenix orbited them all, her fuel gauges showing numbers that made her stomach clench, but her voice never wavering as she provided wind reports and surface updates. Jolly Green, gust front moving in from the southwest, looks like winds increasing to 80 knots in about 5 mics. Copy Phoenix, we've got 6 souls on board, going back for the last 2 now. The final pickup was the most dangerous. The boat's captain had refused to leave until his entire crew was safe, and now he and one remaining crew member clung to a vessel that was visibly settling lower in the water. The Maria Esperanza was dying, her pumps finally overwhelmed by the relentless ingress of seawater. She had perhaps minutes left before she rolled over or simply disappeared beneath the waves. Taylor went down for the last time as Phoenix's low fuel warning light illuminated her cockpit like an accusation. She had 5 minutes of fuel remaining, not enough to make it home even if she left immediately. But the rescue basket was rising through the turbulence with its precious cargo, and the helicopter was beginning its climb away from the sinking vessel. Phoenix 01, all souls recovered, Jolly Green departing to the north. Copy Jolly Green, good work out there. Reese's voice betrayed none of the fear that was beginning to claw at her chest. She'd found the survivors, coordinated their rescue, and seen them safely away. The mission was a complete success. The only problem was that she'd just signed her own death warrant in the process. Her fuel flow indicator showed 3 minutes remaining. Point Loma was 12 minutes away at best speed, and that assumed perfect conditions, which these decidedly were not. The mathematics were inescapable. She wasn't going to make it home. But as she turned Resurrection toward shore, climbing through turbulence that seemed even more violent than before, Phoenix found herself oddly at peace with the equation. She'd learned long ago that some things were worth dying for, and tonight she'd found 8 of them clinging to a sinking boat in the middle of hell. The Phoenix on her arm seemed to pulse with warmth as she pointed her aircraft toward a horizon she might never see. 2 minutes of fuel remaining. Point Loma still 8 minutes away through headwinds that were stealing her forward progress like a thief in the night. Reese had shut down every non-essential system in her aircraft, reduced power to minimum settings that would still keep her airborne, and was flying the most efficient profile her training had ever taught her. But physics didn't care about efficiency or determination. Fuel was fuel, and when it was gone, even the most perfectly flown aircraft became a very expensive glider. Miramar Tower, Phoenix 01 declaring emergency. Low fuel state, requesting immediate vectors to nearest available runway. Phoenix 01 Tower, closest option is North Island, bearing 040 for 6 nautical miles. Winds are favoring runway 29. Emergency equipment is standing by. 6 miles. In normal conditions, that was less than 2 minutes of flight time, but fighting these headwinds with engines that were already sipping from empty tanks, it might as well have been 60 miles. Reese felt the first subtle change in engine performance, a slight roughness that indicated fuel starvation was beginning. Soon, she would experience the aviator's ultimate nightmare, flame out over hostile terrain with nowhere to run. Tower Phoenix 01, I'm not going to make North Island, preparing for emergency landing. The words hung in the radio silence that followed, carrying implications that everyone understood, but no one wanted to voice. Emergency landing in a fighter aircraft. At night, in a storm, over the ocean. The kind of scenario that ended with folded flags and memorial services. But Reese had accepted that possibility the moment she'd chosen to stay with the rescue operation beyond her fuel limitations. She began emergency procedures with the calm professionalism that had carried her through 8 years of military aviation. Emergency, power unit activation, backup systems online, ejection seat armed and ready. If her engines failed, she would have perhaps 30 seconds to choose between riding the aircraft down or punching out into the storm. Neither option offered particularly good odds of survival. But as she ran through her checklists, something unexpected happened. The headwinds that had been fighting her progress began to shift, the storm's circulation pattern finally working in her favor instead of against it. Her ground speed increased by 20 knots, then 30. The same meteorological forces that had been trying to kill her all night suddenly decided to offer assistance. Phoenix 01 Tower, we're showing you at 4 miles southeast. How's your fuel state? Reese glanced at her gauges and felt the first flutter of hope she'd allowed herself in the past hour. Tower, showing 30 seconds remaining, but I'm getting a tailwind now. I think I might make it. The North Island approach was a study in controlled terror. Her engines were running on fumes and prayers, producing just enough thrust to keep her above stall speed as she lined up with runway 29. The approach lights appeared through sheets of rain like a constellation of hope growing larger with each second that her engines continued to run. At 50 feet above the runway, her left engine coughed once and went silent. The aircraft yawed hard to starboard as asymmetric thrust tried to turn her into the storm. Reese compensated with full rudder and aileron, her right hand advancing the remaining throttle to maximum power, even as she wondered if she had enough fuel to complete the landing. At 20 feet, her right engine began to surge, the telltale sign of imminent fuel starvation. But the runway was there, solid and welcoming beneath her landing gear. She felt the main mounts touch concrete just as her final engine went silent, the sudden quiet almost shocking after hours of turbine noise and wind. Resurrection rolled to a stop on the runway centerline as emergency vehicles converged from all directions, their red and blue lights cutting through the rain like celebratory fireworks. Reese sat in her cockpit for a long moment, hands still gripping the controls, hardly believing that she was alive and on solid ground. Her radio crackled with a transmission that would change everything. Phoenix 01, this is Admiral Voss. Outstanding work out there tonight. All 8 souls recovered safely, and you managed to bring yourself home too. That was some of the finest flying I've ever witnessed. But it wasn't the Admiral's praise that stopped her cold. It was the voice that came next, transmitted on the emergency frequency but clearly intended for her. Phoenix 01, this is SEAL Team 5 Actual. Request permission to meet you on the ramp. Commander Marcus Trident Kellerman had been monitoring the rescue frequency from his position at Coronado. As the West Coast SEAL commander responsible for maritime operations, he'd been following the fishing vessel Emergency with professional interest that had gradually transformed into something approaching awe. He'd heard the radio transmissions, understood the impossible conditions, and witnessed one pilot's willingness to sacrifice everything for 8 strangers in distress. The SEALs had a saying, the only easy day was yesterday. But what Phoenix had just accomplished went beyond easy or hard. It was the kind of selfless heroism that defined the warrior ethos at its purest level, and Commander Kellerman knew heroism when he saw it. 20 minutes later, as Reese climbed down from her aircraft on shaking legs, She found herself facing a formation of 12 Navy SEALs in full dress uniform, standing at attention in the pouring rain. At their head stood a man whose reputation preceded him, Marcus Kellerman, whose own chest bore enough ribbons and medals to outfit an entire platoon. The Phoenix tattoo on her arm was clearly visible beneath her rolled-up flight suit sleeve, its ink seeming to glow under the ramp lights. Several of the SEALs noticed it immediately, their expressions shifting from curiosity to something approaching reverence. They recognized the coordinates hidden in those flames, Sasebo Naval Base, where Kellerman himself had once led a classified operation that had saved dozens of American lives. But it wasn't the tattoo that prompted what happened next. It was the simple recognition that they were in the presence of someone who embodied everything they believed about service, sacrifice, and the warrior spirit. Commander Kellerman stepped forward, came to attention, and rendered a slow, deliberate salute that was immediately echoed by every man in his formation. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the storm noise, "it is an honor." The moment stretched like eternity, rain falling on dress uniforms that would need hours of maintenance to repair, on a pilot who had risked everything for strangers, on a scene that would be remembered and retold for generations. This wasn't about gender or politics or proving anything to anyone. This was about recognizing excellence and courage wherever they appeared. Reese returned the salute, her own eyes bright with emotions she hadn't expected to feel. In 8 years of military service, through combat deployments and training exercises, and all the casual cruelty that sometimes accompanied military life, no moment had ever meant more to her than this one. When Captain Morrison and his drinking buddies arrived on scene 20 minutes later, drawn by curiosity and reports of the dramatic rescue, they found Phoenix surrounded by Navy SEALs who were treating her like visiting royalty. The Phoenix tattoo they'd mocked earlier that evening was now the subject of respectful questions from operators who understood that ink often told stories words couldn't capture. Morrison approached the group with his characteristic swagger, apparently unaware that the dynamics had shifted completely since that afternoon's mockery. "Well, Phoenix, I guess even broken clocks are right twice a day. You managed not to crash into the ocean, barely." The silence that followed was profound and uncomfortable. Commander Kellerman turned to face Morrison with the measured precision of someone who had spent years perfecting the art of controlled violence. When he spoke, his voice carried the quiet authority that came from leading men in combat. "Captain, I'm not sure you understand what you just witnessed tonight. This officer flew into conditions that grounded every other aircraft on the West Coast, located 8 souls in distress, and coordinated their rescue while burning her own fuel to levels that should have killed her. She then brought her aircraft home on empty tanks through the worst storm I've seen in 15 years of military service." Kellerman paused, allowing his words to sink in before continuing. "In my experience, there are 2 types of people in this world: those who run toward danger to help others and those who find excuses to run away from it. Tonight, this officer proved exactly which type she is. The question is, Captain, which type are you?" Morrison's face cycled through several shades of red as the implications of the commander's words settled over him like a shroud. Around him, his usual supporters found sudden interest in their shoes, unwilling to associate themselves with someone who had just been dressed down by a living legend. The laughter that had seemed so clever just hours ago now felt petty and small in the face of genuine heroism. But Commander Kellerman wasn't finished. He reached into his dress uniform pocket and withdrew something that made every SEAL in the formation straighten to even more rigid attention. It was a trident, the golden emblem that marked a man as one of the Navy's elite warriors. But this wasn't just any trident. This one bore the scars and tarnish of combat operations, its edges worn smooth by years of faithful service. "Phoenix," he said, extending the emblem toward her. "This belonged to Chief Petty Officer Antonio Valdez, who died in my arms during a classified operation in the South China Sea. His last words were that he wanted his trident to go to someone who understood what it meant to put others before yourself. Rhys's hands trembled slightly as she accepted the emblem, feeling the weight of history and sacrifice in its worn metal. Around them, the storm was finally beginning to subside, wind speeds dropping and rain shifting from horizontal to merely vertical. But the real change was in the faces surrounding her, expressions that had shifted from mockery to respect, from dismissal to recognition. Chief Valdez earned 3 Purple Hearts and a Silver Star before he was 25, Kellerman continued. He would have been proud to see what you did tonight. That kind of courage, putting your life on the line for people you've never met, that's what separates warriors from everyone else. He stepped back and saluted again, a gesture immediately echoed by his entire formation. But this time, other voices joined the tribute. Ground crew members who had witnessed her departure and miraculous return. Operations personnel who had tracked her progress through the storm. Even some of Morrison's former supporters found themselves standing straighter, their hands moving instinctively towards salute position. The Phoenix tattoo caught the light one final time as Rhys carefully pinned Chief Valdez's trident to her flight suit. The coordinates hidden in those inked flames, 33, 6,405 degrees N, 130, 8,777 degrees E, suddenly took on new meaning for everyone present. They weren't just numbers marking a location. They were a monument to the night that had forged her into the warrior who stood before them now. 3 months later, the story had taken on legendary status throughout naval aviation. Not just the rescue itself, though that had been remarkable enough. It was the moment afterward, when one of the Navy's most decorated SEAL commanders had recognized something in a pilot that others had chosen to mock. The image of those 12 operators standing at attention in the rain, saluting someone whose courage had impressed even them, became a symbol of what military service could be at its finest. The Maria Esperanza survivors had recovered fully from their ordeal, each one sending personal letters of gratitude to the pilot they credited with saving their lives. The fishing vessel's captain, Miguel Santos, had done more than right. He traveled from San Diego to Miramar specifically to thank Phoenix in person and to present her with a small carved wooden phoenix that his daughter had made. "For the angel who flies through storms," he'd said, tears streaming down his weathered face. Rhys kept the carving on her desk next to Chief Valdez's trident, both serving as reminders of why she wore the uniform. The mockery had stopped entirely, replaced by something she valued far more, genuine respect from peers who had witnessed her actions rather than just her appearance. Flight assignments that had once gone to more reliable pilots now came her way first. Squadron commanders who had once questioned her capabilities now sought her input on complex missions. But perhaps the most meaningful change came from an unexpected source. Captain Morrison, his ego finally deflated by the weight of his own inadequacy, had requested a private meeting 2 weeks after the rescue. The swagger was gone, replaced by something that might have been humility if it hadn't been so clearly forced. "Phoenix," he'd said, avoiding her eyes, "I owe you an apology, several apologies actually. The things I said, the way I treated you, that was wrong. You've proven yourself in ways that put the rest of us to shame." Rhys had listened without interruption, recognizing the difficulty such words must have cost a man accustomed to being the center of attention. When he finished, she'd simply nodded. "Apology accepted, Captain. We all have things to learn about ourselves." Morrison had left that meeting a different man, not necessarily better, but certainly more aware of his own limitations. The casual cruelty that had once characterized his interactions with female officers became a thing of the past, replaced by a grudging professionalism that was probably the best he could manage. The Phoenix tattoo no longer drew snickers or crude comments. Instead, it prompted questions, respectful inquiries about its meaning and the story behind those coordinates. Rhys found herself becoming an unofficial mentor to younger female aviators, sharing not just technical knowledge but the harder-won wisdom about perseverance and proving oneself through actions rather than words. Commander Kellerman had become an unexpected friend, stopping by Miramar whenever his duties brought him to the area. Their conversations ranged from tactical aviation to the broader philosophy of military service, discussions that reminded both of them why they had chosen careers that demanded everything and promised nothing but the opportunity to serve something greater than themselves. "You know what impressed me most about that night?" Kellerman asked during one such visit, watching Reese conduct a pre-flight briefing for her students. "It wasn't the flying, though that was exceptional. It wasn't even the courage, though you showed plenty of that. It was the complete absence of ego in your decision-making. You never asked whether anyone would appreciate what you were doing, never wondered if the risk was worth the recognition. You just saw people who needed help and did whatever was necessary to provide it." Reese smiled, adjusting her flight suit sleeve so that the Phoenix tattoo was visible. The coordinates were fading slightly after years of sun and salt air, but their meaning had only grown stronger. "My grandfather used to tell me that true strength isn't about what you can do, it's about what you're willing to do when no one's watching and no one will thank you for it." "Chief Valdez would have liked your grandfather," Kellerman replied. "He believed the same thing." As she walked toward her aircraft for another training flight, Reese reflected on the strange journey that had brought her to this point. The mockery that had once stung so deeply now seemed like a lifetime ago, replaced by relationships built on mutual respect and shared purpose. The phoenix on her arm had indeed risen from ashes, not just the literal flames hidden in its design, but the metaphorical fire of adversity that had tested and ultimately strengthened her resolve. Behind her, a new class of student naval aviators prepared for their first formation flight, their faces bright with the confidence that came from being trained by someone whose reputation preceded her. They would carry forward the lessons she taught them, not just about flying, but about service and sacrifice, and the sometimes terrible cost of doing what's right. The storm clouds that had once threatened to destroy her had become the crucible in which her legend was forged. And somewhere in the vast Pacific, 8 souls went about their daily lives, forever grateful to the Phoenix who had refused to let them vanish into the darkness. The coordinates tattooed on her arm, 33, 6,405 degrees N, 130, 8,777 degrees E, marked more than just a location in Japan. They marked the moment when Lieutenant Commander Reese Phoenix Novak had learned that sometimes the most important battles aren't fought against external enemies, but against the limitations others try to impose on your dreams. As Resurrection's engine spooled up for another mission, the Phoenix tattoo caught the morning sun. Its wings spread wide in eternal flight toward whatever challenges awaited on the horizon.